So good afternoon. I'm Jessica Matthews, President of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Great pleasure to welcome all of you here for what I think is going to be a fascinating afternoon that will be looking at India's upcoming general elections and its likely impact on the country's economy and foreign policy and domestic politics. I think everybody here knows this is Carnegie has made South Asia and India a major focus of its work, and we're excited to be building on that this year with two major initiatives that relate to this important moment in India's history. One is an initiative that we're calling India Decides 2014, which analyzes the dynamics and the likely impacts of the election. And the second coincides with this open window of this very critical moment of decision-making after the election and just at the time of the formation of the new government, which we will be marking with the release of a major volume entitled Getting India Back on Track, an Action Agenda for Reform, which is a volume that has brought together 17 or 18 of India's leading thinkers and experts, each of whom has taken a piece of the policy agenda and written a very tightly edited, short analysis of what is the immediate agenda for reform, the next 5 years, what most needs to be done in that particular area. And several of the authors are with us today, and we're going to be hearing about that work as well. As some of you, I think, probably know, we announced last year that we hope to be opening a new research center in New Delhi. I hope that before the end of 2014, our current 5 centers will be 6, and where we will be grappling with both the India's domestic agenda, help articulate from New Delhi Indian perspectives on critical regional and global issues, and work better than we can just from here to strengthen the U.S.-India bilateral relationship. So today's event also marks the launch of a third project, the U.S. launch of an innovative, really quite extraordinary survey project that's attempting to track the attitudes of a very broad cross-section of Indians. You'll hear just how broad in a few minutes. The project is an initiative of the Lok Foundation that's represented here today by its founder, Rajiv Lal. And we are enormously pleased to welcome him here to Carnegie. And it aims to deepen our collective understanding and India's collective understanding of the changing social and political attitudes of Indians from all over the country. We are partnering with this with our regular partners at the Center for the Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania. And Devesh Kapoor, the director of the center, is with us today, and we are enormously pleased to have him also. So that's the big agenda, and I'm going to turn things over to George to introduce the panel and get us started. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thanks, Jessica, because she gave a good head start on what my job is, so I can be a slacker. This is a great project that we've just been undertaking, and for those of you who are on Twitter, which I know doesn't include Ashley Tallis, and we're trying to persuade him to join. But Millen here is a real pro at it, and so you can appreciate, those of you who follow him can appreciate, and those of you who don't should start. But you'll appreciate the expert use of information and data and graphics and so on, which something like an election really lends itself to. And so this project goes very deep, but it also, in terms of distributing kind of information and insights, is doing it in digestible bits as well. I think today will be deeper than more digestible in tweets, and so at least that's our intention. So Milan's going to lead off and do actually a presentation of kind of a take on the electorate and the election. And for those of you who don't know, Milan is an associate in the South Asia program here at Carnegie, which we're glad to say, and he's coordinating this initiative on the Indian election. And his primary focus is on the political economy of India, and examining issues such as corruption, governance, state capacity, distributive politics, and electoral behavior. His work in particular on corruption and kind of explaining the incidence of criminals in elected position in India is super fascinating and will be available at some point in a book-length treatment. No pressure. Exactly. And then Rajiv Lal, whom Jessica briefly introduced, will be the direct respondent to Milan. And Rajiv, as Jessica mentioned, is the founder of the Lok Foundation and executive chairman of Infrastructure Development Finance Company. He's got 3 decades of experience in various facets of international finance through investment banks, multilateral agencies, and academia. He's interested in project finance, private equity and venture capital, international capital markets, trade, infrastructure, and macroeconomic policy. All of which, if I had a young child, I'd say, go do that, and then you can take care of me in my retirement, unlike poor political scientists. And so Rajiv will be our first commentator. And then you all know Devesh Kapoor, who is the director of the Center for Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania. And he's a non-resident fellow across the street at the Center for Global Development, and also the author of the recent book, Diaspora, Democracy, and Development, The Impact of International Migration from India on India. And so this is our cast of characters here for the first panel. And I'll have a little more to say at the end of that. So Milan, please.
Great. Thank you very much, George. First and foremost, for justifying my use of Twitter. And when my wife asked me why I'm checking my phone at the dinner table, I now have an official backing of my employer. Thank you all for coming. Let me just take a minute to profusely thank Rajiv Lal and the Lok Foundation for sponsoring this work, which I think is going to be really fun. It has been a lot of fun to work on and going to be very insightful. And for inviting us really to be a part of this. And I'd also like to thank my partner in crime, Devesh Kapoor, for also his collaboration and working together. It's been a lot of fun. And I also want to highlight 2 of Devesh's colleagues and my good friends, Nilanjan Sarkar and Megan Reed, who are sitting here, who are very much part of this team. And of course, I want to thank my Carnegie colleagues for their support and all of you for coming. What I'm going to do in hopefully about 20 or 25 minutes, we're a little bit behind schedule, and I don't want to take away from the brilliance of the next panel, is to talk a little bit about the Indian voter in the year 2014. We've heard a lot about political parties. We've heard a lot about Narendra Modi. We've heard a lot about Rahul Gandhi. But we haven't really heard too much about the nature of the Indian voter and how that Indian voter may or may not be changing. So that's going to be the focus of my remarks today. And let me just say a word by way of introduction about the Lok surveys, which again has been Rajiv's brainchild that we've been so lucky to be a part of. The objective of the surveys that the Lok Foundation is undertaking is really to try to understand, as Jessica said, the nature of the social and political configurations that are taking place across India today. And the idea is to invest in a multi-year panel survey of 65,000 households all across India. So panel survey meaning that every year we will be visiting and revisiting the same set of households. So understanding not only India from east to west, north and south, but also how India and the Indian citizen is changing over time. And operationally, we're doing this by piggybacking on an existing survey run by an organization called CMIE, which every quarter of every year goes to 150,000 households across India, asking them about their consumer habits. So it's not a social science survey, it's a consumer survey. We're adding onto that a social science module twice a year for the next several years. So this is really just the tip of the iceberg, our first foray. This is the kind of roadmap. The survey I'm going to be speaking of today was conducted in the last quarter of 2013. We currently have a survey in the field under the ominous title Aspirations and Anxieties, which is really trying to get at issues of social mobility, economic mobility, public safety, and such issues. We're going to be doing a follow-on survey to this election survey after the elections have concluded in the third quarter of this year. So we'll be seeing these same voters who have told us how they're going to vote and what's on their mind, and then we can ask them again after the election if anything changed. So I'm going to talk about two things today. I have to start, of course, with the electoral horse race because that's why everyone has shown up. But since you're here, I'm going to then take advantage of that and talk a little bit about what we're calling the 5 myths about the Indian voter. And I have a question mark there, and that's intentional because we're still trying to get our heads around these myths, but we think that there are a number of interesting and perhaps counterintuitive things that are going on. I'll just quickly list them and then we'll go through them. The first is that regional parties are surging at the expense of the two national parties, the BJP and the Congress. The second is that in India, good economics is not a recipe for good politics, for electoral success. The third is that voters are fed up with political dynasties, not just the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty, but all dynasties, the closing off of the political elite. That the criminality we see that's so pervasive in Indian politics is a result of a lack of information on the part of the voter. And the fifth is this idea that in India you vote your caste rather than you cast your vote. And I think in each of these 5 things, our conventional wisdom needs to be revisited. But let me start with the fun stuff, which is the horse race. So according to our survey, which again was carried out at the last quarter of 2013, our estimation is that the BJP-led NDA, National Democratic Alliance, if the elections were held at the end of the year, would get around 31% of the vote, which is a very significant rise from the 21.5% of the vote they got in 2009. The Congress-led UPA government, which had come into office with about 31.5% of the vote, would go down to 23%. So they're essentially switching places. Now, if one looks at other surveys that have been done, starting from the CSDS survey of July 2013, which was a very neck-and-neck survey that was throwing up a hung assembly, hung Lok Sabha, you see that there is a lead opening up of the NDA over the UPA. Our survey, which was done at the end of last year, is very close to the recent Nielsen survey, which came out in terms of the top-line figures. But in each and every survey, we're seeing a clear and systematic lead of the NDA over the UPA. Our survey is very much a part of that trend. This is going to be very hard to read for those of you in the back. This is essentially going at the 15 major states where we focused our survey and the vote swings for the NDA. And I just want to highlight 2 things. One is the significant increase in vote share in the key states of the Hindi heartland. So in Bihar, a 23% positive vote swing in the favor of the BJP. In Uttar Pradesh, the most populous state with 80 Lok Sabha seats, 12% rise for the BJP. But it's not just in the states of the Hindi heartland north where the BJP appears to be surging. It's also in places where, at least more recently, they haven't had much presence. So in the state of Tamil Nadu, for instance, where they've just stitched together a new alliance, their vote swing is up 11%. The only state of the 15 main ones that we see them actually falling back is in Karnataka, which is the state that they had controlled until May of last year and then lost to the Congress. Now, this is the UPA picture, right? All of that blue we saw now turns to red because there have been huge losses for the Congress Party. in several states which were the largest contributors to its overall kitty. So Andhra Pradesh, huge losses of 22%. Similarly in Haryana. In many of the states that are critical battleground states, whether it's Maharashtra, whether it's Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, sizable losses. There are some offsetting gains in 3 states, that's Bihar, Karnataka, and the state of West Bengal, which no doubt are probably cold comfort for the ruling regime. When we look at urban-rural differences, this was quite striking. The NDA is leading the UPA both in urban as well as in rural areas. And remember, rural areas is really where the focus of this government has been, and certainly their decision-making has been geared towards winning over the rural voter. And that does not appear to be happening. The NDA is leading the UPA in both urban and rural, although they tend to do better among those who are better off. So if you look here, you have rural, urban broken down by literacy. And you can see that the biggest differences in the vote share is among the better off in rural and urban. When we look at the caste and identity-wise nature of support, you'll see here on the far end the BJP doing very well amongst the upper caste, which are a traditional votary of the BJP, and doing miserably among Muslims, which are traditionally not been a support of the BJP. But the big story is right here in the middle. The other backward classes, the big section, 40 or 50% of the country which falls into this group, which the BJP was counting on to be the pivotal swing voter, appears to be working in its favor. And this was a decisive strategy because, of course, Narendra Modi is himself belonging to this group. And also, very interestingly, among the Dalits, the scheduled castes, the SCs, the BJP has also been besting the UPA among those groups. We are not in the business of putting out a seat share. You've seen what the numbers others have put out. That calculation or translation from votes to seats is an art rather than a science. We would just say the following thing, that the translation is going to, of course, depend on things which are playing out as we speak, which is the effects of the campaign, the actual candidates, which are only now becoming known, and the alliances. Just in the past couple of weeks, we've seen movement, particularly on the NDA side, of building bigger alliances, which, of course, is going to have an impact on the bottom line. Let me transition now to talking about these myths and just take them on one by one. The first is this idea that India is experiencing a kind of linear, unending political fragmentation whereby you're seeing the rise of regional parties, basically chipping away at the national parties. And if this process plays out, you're going to see kind of unending fragmentation and this kind of chaos and anarchy that we think of when we look across the Indian political spectrum. What's quite interesting is if you look at the relative vote share, going back the past 5 election cycles, when you add up the Congress and BJP share of the vote, it's been roughly stable at about 50%, with other regional parties getting another 50% or so. In recent years, you'll see there is a steady but slow increase. Regional parties in 2009 got about 53% of the vote. Now, that has not translated into 53% of the seats because regional parties are actually cannibalizing each other's votes. If you look at the All India vote share estimates for the 2 main coalitions, they're all above 50%. Even if you subtract the allies, the BJP plus Congress would be above 50%. So that trend in 2014 doesn't appear to be changing. What has held true for the past 5 election cycles looks to be true again this election year. So what we are seeing in a sense is that 50% share of the vote that belongs either to the BJP or the Congress is still intact, but the composition has changed. So there's been what we call a reversal of fortune, which is basically the UPA of the Congress and the NDA of the BJP have switched places, as you can see that in this bar chart. The second myth is this idea that in India, voters don't care much for good, sound economic policy. that doesn't make for good politics. What makes for good politics is appeals to patronage, clientelism, caste, identity, parochial issues. And we find that not to be the case. When you ask Indian voters, what is the single most important issue that's going to determine your vote choice, the top 3 out of the 4 issues are economic in nature. Economic growth is number 1. Corruption is number 2. Inflation/price rise is 3. And changes to personal family income is number 4. Issues that we have traditionally thought to be very important of social identity, of access to government patronage and support, ranks quite low. Now, there is a pretty considerable variation if you take the number 1 response, which is economic growth. The average is 25%, but you can see here the range across states is pretty huge. So in the states of Chhattisgarh, Punjab, and Gujarat, above 40% of respondents say growth is our number 1 issue. Compare that to UP and Bihar, where only 13 and 7% respectively say growth is the number 1 issue. So what do those people in UP and Bihar think is very important? It's corruption. Corruption is a very important issue in those 2 traditionally quote-unquote backward states of the Hindi North. But interestingly, it's not just a backward state phenomenon, because number 1 is Kerala, which we think of as the OECD country buried inside of India. Corruption is the number 1 issue. Economic growth, as I mentioned, is the number 1 issue for a number of states. The only 2 states in which inflation is the number 1 issue, which is the issue that we keep hearing so much about, are in the states of Maharashtra and the state of Haryana. A sub-myth that we took a look at is this idea that Muslim voters, that India's largest minority community, votes in a different way. Because the conventional narrative is that the Muslim community cares more about identity, they care more about parochial issues, community, and so on and so forth. What we find is actually quite the opposite. That what matters to Muslim voters are by and large the same things that matter to Hindu voters. They are saying that issues of growth, inflation, corruption are their top 3 issues. So we don't see a lot of variation there. Similarly, there's a story of Bharat versus India, right? This kind of urban-rural divide that exists. The real India is in Bharat, and the kind of westernized urban elite are in India. That kind of binary discussion that we hear so much about, again, doesn't appear to be the case. By and large, the broad priorities are the same. There are a few small differences. Rural folks care more about access to government. They care a little bit more about shocks to their own personal family income. But the top 3 remain the same. The third issue is this issue of dynastic politics. And we're told that this year is going to be very different. People are going to take a hard stance against this idea that it's only people of dynastic political families which are going to be India's next parliamentarians. If you look at the data, this is data collected by 2 political scientists. In 2004, 20% of members of parliament either had a concurrently serving family member or one who was a direct predecessor. That number went up in 2009 to 29%. So nearly a third now are dynastic in nature. So we decided to ask voters, would you prefer to vote for an MP who has a direct family connection in politics? And what we found was kind of shocking. 46% said yes. So nearly 1 in 2 Indians say, if I have a choice, I would prefer to vote for a candidate who has a family background, which is not, again, what we're so used to hearing. So then we decided to say, okay, well, why is that? The number 1 response is because doing politics is their occupation, and they're going to be better at it. So politics is something which passes through one's DNA. And what better way than if your parents, for instance, were politicians? The number 2 response, which was very close behind, was very similar, that these people are more exposed. And so by a process of osmosis, they're able to absorb more about doing politics. This idea that people like dynastic politicians because it gives them stuff, better patronage and services, was the lowest response. fourth is my particular hobby horse, which is this issue of why does India and the Indian voters continually, why are they electing candidates with criminal backgrounds who have, at the time of their nomination, pending criminal cases, often of quite a serious nature. We know that from data that we now have, in 2004, roughly a quarter of MPs were under criminal indictment, half of those for charges of a serious nature, despite a huge amount of effort in the NGO community, by the media, to publicize this fact. Those numbers went up over 5 years rather than went down. So today, 30% of the 15th Lok Sabha is under criminal scrutiny. Again, half of those people, slightly more than half, 19%, for charges of a serious nature. So forget about libel, slander, unlawful assembly. We're talking about murder, attempted murder, kidnapping, extortion, sexual assault. I mean, these are serious crimes that would merit real jail time if a conviction was obtained. So we decided to ask people, how do you feel about voting for a candidate who has serious criminal charges, but who gets stuff done? And about a quarter of respondents, 26%, said, we have no problem. Happy to vote for that person. Now, what's hard to know is this a genuine number? Obviously, it's a sensitive question. If you come into my house and ask, am I going to vote for a criminal, I may be embarrassed and I might say no. So we decided to do a little experiment, which is to randomly divide up these respondents into two groups, a treatment and a control group, where we eventually said, how many of these kinds of candidates would you be willing to support? And we sort of gave them a bunch of innocuous attributes, a wealthy candidate, a poor candidate, an independent candidate. And if you've done this random division properly, the answers in the treatment and control should be the same. There's no reason why the responses should be different. Now, the difference is in the treatment group, we added an additional attribute, which is, would it trouble you if there was a candidate with a serious criminal charge? Now, we're not asking voters to say which of these bother us, but just how many. And so you can compare the average responses in these two groups to then back out and calculate what the true level of support is for candidates with serious criminal charges. The true level of support is nearly 50%. So 26% of Indians are willing to say to your face, which I think is a high number, that we are happy to support such people. But if you do this indirectly, nearly half admit that they're willing to support. This support is correlated with prevalence. So in other words, places where people are more likely to support through this indirect method is where you happen to see the greatest share of candidates with criminal charges. So the fifth, and I'm going to end here, is this idea that Indians vote for their caste rather than cast your vote. And this is a tricky one, and I'll admit that we're still trying to figure this out, and Devesh is going to explain to you how it all makes sense. I'll just show you the numbers. So we said before that identity ranks last. When we asked people what mattered to you, the 8 out of 8 response was identity. Only 3% said protection of my caste or my religious community's interests is the number one priority. But if you ask people a slightly different question, which is, A, how important to you is it that your representative is somebody of your community? 46% say it's important that my representative is from my caste or my religion. Then if you ask them, how important or how troubled would you be if the MP of your constituency is from a different group? So if you're an upper caste, that person is a scheduled caste. Or if you're a backward caste, that person is an upper caste. 36% say they'd be troubled by that. So despite the fact that they don't think it's very important, there clearly are very strong social biases at work. So again, to try to understand, is this number that we're getting here, this 36% of ethnic bias, ethnic discrimination, actually a real number? We did a very similar experiment as I described before, this time asking them a different set of statements where we added a statement for the treatment group of whether or not somebody of a different caste wins the election. So, and this was randomly generated. So if you were an upper caste respondent, you were randomly shown a different caste other than your own. 57%, right? So there's almost a 20 percentage point increase when you ask this question indirectly in terms of ethnic bias against people of a different caste. So how do we square these two facts? And it's something that we're puzzling through. And I think, one way to think about it is that, identity predicts vote choice, but not necessarily electoral outcomes. So this is a graph of support for the NDA between 2009 and 2014 by caste, upper caste, OBC, SC, ST, Muslim. And for some of these groups, namely the upper castes and OBCs, there are pretty significant shifts, less so for the Dalits. Now, there is something else going on if identity is a static concept that is forcing these large shifts within these social groups. We think what's forcing that are issues of the economy and issues of governance. In other words, identity is important, but there are other things which explain the changes as opposed to levels of support. So let me just wrap up here with a couple of final statements. One is, I think sort of fairly obvious, is that Indian society is changing. We all know that. We have a gut sense that that's true. And clearly that's being reflected in the preferences of voters. That we need to revisit some of the assumptions that we've had about how the Indian voter thinks and acts. The second is, while the majority of India remains rural, rural India is increasingly being shaped by urban sensibilities. This idea of an urban-rural divide as two very separate and distinct entities is increasingly being blurred. It's being blurred because of technology, because of social media, because of migration, because of better rural connectivity, and so on and so forth. But this binary that we think of, I think, needs to be revisited. Like I said in my slide before, the social biases are clearly endemic. They are an issue. They haven't gone away. They still are part of the political process of mobilization and vote getting and so on and so forth. But it's really caste plus. It seems that caste and identity and religion is not enough, that there is an interaction going on between social identity and other issues of real substance. The changes, that interaction that I described, really seems to be about the economy. That we have a view in the United States and most advanced industrial democracies of it's the economy, stupid, right? That's how you figure out who's going to win and lose elections. But we've never thought that that model applies very well to India. That seems to be changing. And there's good evidence to support that we are seeing a shift in that direction. Clearly, this is a change election. I think this data support that. They show unprecedented levels of support for the BJP. Whether or not that will hold up in the next few weeks remains to be seen, but clearly there's a sense of anti-incumbency, a sense of economic malaise, a sense of a change in direction. But we won't really know until mid-May what that means, which is our final cop-out, parting gift to you all. This is a process that's unfolding in real time, so we'll continue to be mining this data for interesting insights, and given the websites and Twitter handles and so on and so forth, we've have had an ongoing series of articles in the Times of India, the fourth and final piece, which will be written by Dr. Lal. He hasn't written it yet. He's writing it afterwards. He's informed us. Will be out this Sunday. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Okay. So he gave like the trailer. Do you want to give us like a full preview of what you're going to say in your next article, or you want to comment more broadly on it?
Yeah, so I thought what I've been struggling with what to write in the last piece. I was hoping that Milind and Devesh would take care of it for me. I just put my name to it. But the reason I'm struggling with it is that there's actually a lot more nuance to what's coming out of the survey. than first appears. I mean, we can try to make sense of it, but there are a lot of unanswered questions. So what I thought I'd do in a few minutes is really try to focus on or draw attention to the 2 or 3 paradoxes as I see emerging from the results of the research so far, and perhaps suggest to Devesh and Milan and team some questions that we all should focus on as we continue pursuing this research. I should mention that this whole exercise of these surveys is going to be an ongoing process, and what Devesh and Milan have done is actually design the process very intelligently, and fortuitously, we will have the opportunity to revisit the same households after the elections. So we will have a lot more rich data that we could be happily mining for some time. So with that, let me turn to what seem to me as the 3 paradoxes that emerge from the work. I really personally got interested in doing a lot of this because like many of us, I was very anxious and curious to mark and to follow the process of political evolution in the country, and hopefully capture that inflection point in time where the basis for voter concerns and electoral outcomes moves away from the politics of identity to something else, from identity to development, shall we say. That obviously is personally much more appealing to one. And that actually is the first paradox. So while there are a number of pointers that suggest that, yes, it's economic issues, it's the economy stupid, that are really looming large in terms of voter concerns and will have a big impact on how people actually cast their vote over the next few weeks, there is equally very compelling evidence that the Indian voter continues to carry very significant, not surprisingly, historical baggage to do with social bias and prejudice. So the list questions from the survey on comfort levels with respect to who gets elected in your constituency are actually hugely revealing. So as preoccupied as the voters seem to be with economic issues, they're also deeply troubled by somebody not from their community being elected to their particular constituency. So I think the jury is still out whether economics now transcends identity. We are still somewhere in that transition. And one should understand the wider economic context in which these changes are happening. And from the point of view of the UPA, actually, it's all quite unfortunate because if you look at the record of the last 10 years in terms of the performance of the Indian economy, it's actually been quite remarkable. Poverty levels, no matter how you measure them, have come down dramatically. In rural India, people below the poverty line have plummeted from 42% of the population to 26%. This is since 2004. If you look at the penetration of services that have had transformational impact on households, particularly in rural India, rural telephony, the penetration of rural telephony has gone up from 1% to 40% just in the last decade. The rural roads program has been an extraordinary achievement of the UPA government, although they cannot take full credit for it because it was something that was seeded by the government before them. But nevertheless, in the last decade, they have very significantly raised public expenditure on rural connectivity by roads. And, we've been spending close to $15 billion a year. That has now connected Tier 5, Tier 6 India, as it is called, to urban centers and made transformational changes in people's lives. Yet, it is the economy stupid that is looming large in people's mind because of what seems to have happened over the last 24, 36 months. As much success as we've had in creating new jobs over the last decade, there is now very suddenly very dramatic increase in uncertainty with respect to people's livelihoods. And inflation, affordability, particularly food prices, have suddenly changed the mood of the electorate. So the UPA, for all its contributions, as per these numbers over the last decade, have lost the plot pretty much in the last 24 months, because you're only as good for the purpose of the election as your last paper, right? So that's the first paradox. The second paradox is to do with corruption. And as you saw, corruption looms very, very large at the very top of voter concerns. And yet, again through the list questions, we find there is a country, half of us have very high degree of tolerance for criminality in politics. And we have a high degree of tolerance for dynasty in politics. On the grounds, as the survey indicates, of competencies that go with family businesses. So there, the explanation again, I think, is a credible one, and but it leads to a difficult and a disturbing conclusion as follows: that our tolerance for criminality coexists for our intolerance with corruption, because we are so desperate for somebody to offer us the services we know we deserve. And there, even as poverty levels have come down and the performance, in general economic terms over the last decade has been impressive, if you track the quality of services that the state is responsible for, that's a story, actually, of largely uniform decline. So whether it is access to public health, whether it is access to drinking water, whether it is in urban India especially, access to solid waste disposal, water treatment, no matter what metric you choose, I can reel off a whole series of numbers that will tell you how the quality of life as a result of deteriorating service provision by government the quality of life has deteriorated over the last decade, even though poverty indicators and such like suggest significant improvement. So that conundrum, that paradox is explainable, but the problematic conclusion that it leads to is that because of the way we vote, we are looking for patrons to solve our immediate problems, right? Voting behavior today, as yet, is not likely to change the behavior of political parties. So it is licensed for political parties to actually put up a whole bunch of criminals for elections. It is licensed for political parties to continue with family in politics, despite the fact that the voters are terribly, fed up with corruption. Their voting behavior does not motivate me, the politician, to change the way I conduct politics, and that's really disturbing. The third conundrum, and maybe I'm making more of this, Devesh, than comes out, but I wanted for us to think about this. One of the interesting findings that struck me was that how benefits programs are very low on people's list of electoral concerns. And yet, again, the empirical evidence is that although, again, good news on poverty reduction, et cetera, there is an emerging story of differential access to assets, the ability to create assets, access to opportunity, differential access even to public services. And that discrimination in access actually has a social basis to it. So if you look at the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in particular, right, on every indicator, with access to electricity, water, nutrition, you name it, how many below the poverty line, there is growing evidence of concentrated problems in socially disadvantaged communities. So I was surprised by how low the benefits program of government scored in the list of voter concerns. And I had a couple of hypotheses that I wanted to suggest for why that might be the case. One is that we are very much a country of self-employed. If you look at the employment numbers, for example, over the last decade, we created something like 80 million new jobs. But 80% of them were all casual labor or self-employed. So if you look at the unemployment numbers, they mask a lot of other stuff going on, but the unemployment numbers remain stable. But that's only because 50, 60 odd million Indians got on with it by making the best of the situation and finding self-employment. And a lot of the robustness of the non-farm rural economy has something to do with their ability to do that. So it could be that a lot of us are really not looking for handouts. They don't care about. They don't know how long they will last. And we're basically more self-reliant. That may be an explanation, but I'm not entirely convinced. The other thing I think that it leads us to explore a little more is the evidence that you have shared where you have disproportionate support for the Congress Party and its allies coming from scheduled tribes in particular and the Muslim community. Right? Could it be that we are at the point where there is going to be a polarization that eventually manifests itself into competing, more or less a two-party kind of national system, with increasingly manifested, better articulated, different economic, political philosophies? The Congress Party being more aligned to, shall we call it, the paternalistic state, and the NDA and its coalition partners being more libertarian, sort of in their approach, if you like, creating more opportunity rather than dependence on the state. So with that, I just wanted to suggest 2 or 3 questions for the future that this research raises. I would be really very keen to understand better what would it take to actually change political behavior, the behavior of politicians, right? So one thing that we could focus on is we could ask the questions, do criminals actually deliver? I don't know if we can find a way of getting to that. So, if after successive elections, voters find that, having been brutally pragmatic and acquired a patron, that patron fails to deliver, then maybe that will be an ultimate trigger for change. The second thing I think we could fruitfully explore is this question about at what point does economics actually transcend the politics of identity. I'm not entirely convinced, based on the evidence today, that we are at that point. But perhaps from the data that we have collected and that we will collect, we can ask a very specific question. How many amongst the scheduled tribes and the Muslim community actually will switch their votes from the Congress to the NDA? And if you find that there is a significant switch, that would be very compelling evidence that people are now willing and able to vote beyond their identity. So I think I've taken more than my allotted time. That's my 2 cents. Thank you.
Thanks, Rajiv. It's always a risk to take more than your allotted time, but when you're really interesting, it works out okay. And so you were. So I think it added a lot to quality to it. So with the understanding that the VESH is available, and so all three of these guys will comment and advocate. Let's get as many questions in as we can. Another 15 minutes or so. Yes. Yeah, please. And then Danielle will give you your name, and then next, Molly will give it to Paulie, which...
Sadanand Dhume from the American Enterprise Institute. And I guess my question is for Devesh because we haven't heard from him. I had two questions. I'm presuming that all of you will answer on the slides that Milind had put forward. The first was this idea of national parties being strong and the regional parties not really gaining share. And I noticed that in the first graph you had BJP and Congress, and then later you had NDA and UPA. But those are really not the same thing, right? Because you have parties such as the Shiv Sena, National Conference, Akali Dal, that are part of either the NDA or the UPA, but are still very much regional parties. So I'm wondering, how does that look if you actually are looking purely at Congress plus BJP? Is it substantially the same, or is it in fact different? That's the first. And the second question was on the Muslim voter. It's very striking to see two things. The first is that there's very, very little support for the NDA. 12%, I think, was the number. But also that is more than it was in 2009. So you've gone from 9% in 2009 to 12% in 2014. Do you have any explanation for what's going on over there? Thanks.
Great. Then Molly, give Paulie the mic. Just go ahead and Devesh, go ahead and try to answer that one, and then we'll come back to Paulie really quick.
Okay. You might need to just pull the...
There's actually, if you have just the BJP and the Congress, their combined share is above 50% since 1996. It has really not changed. If you look at the shares of the Akali Dal or Shiv Sena, the smaller parties aligned with the NDA, their vote share is really very, very modest. So those results stand even if you strip away the smaller parties. I think the shift that you see with Muslim League voters, which is a marginal shift, but nonetheless it is a shift, is the broader shift that is occurring, although at the margin, about identity politics. I think our sense is, and we have to do more work, that it is likely that Indian voting is going to become more like volatile. And the volatile component of the voter is the so-called lower middle class voter. People who over the past decade used to be poor, but because of growth have just come up above the poverty line. They are no longer desperate for their next meal. They have aspirations and expectations which they're looking for someone like to meet. And that spans all castes, all religions. And that is the crucial, I think, swing voter. So the base voter has the identity politics. The swing voter is looking for economic change. They have experienced economic change in their lives, and they're looking for more. Their expectations and aspirations are high. And that includes some, but not a huge lot, of Muslim voters.
Great. Paulie.
I'm Polly Nayak. I'm an independent consultant with a long history on South Asia. And actually, my question, you have, Devesh Kapoor has just in part addressed, which was about the role of rising expectations in moving rural and urban voters closer together, in changing the salience of service delivery as an issue and so forth. The second part of the question, which relates to that, is the extent to which since we use class descriptors in talking about Indian voters, we talk about lower middle class, we talk about upper middle class, we talk about rising standards of living and expectations. To what extent are we going to see perhaps class as a driver in not perhaps this election, but in the next 5 years, and how might parties realign their appeals to hit class across some of the social identities we've been talking about? What is your forecast based on the trends that you're watching?
Two things, Polly. One is that you have to come back in 3 months because we've asked this question on our aspiration survey that I mentioned is in the field, where we asked a number of questions about economic mobility and social mobility, but we also asked people whether or not they would self-identify as being part of the Indian middle class. And so it'll be very interesting to see, because we know what their true economic status actually is, to then compare that to their perception. So that's number one. So part of it is you're stuck coming back in 3 months. But the second is, I do think that there is a shift underway, and I think we all have to admit that Narendra Modi has built his campaign in part around this principle. I mean, if you look at the record of his electoral politics in Gujarat, it's really been about tapping into an awakening, what he calls the neo-middle class. So these are people who are still pretty poor, but they've made a transition from rural to urban. They maybe have a steady job rather than just casual labor. And they have aspirations, and they've tasted the fruits of growth, and they're demanding more. And I think that reservoir of people, especially in parts of the Hindi heartland where Modi has really been out barnstorming, seems to be paying dividends, where people are responding to this kind of class and aspirational cue. So that's somewhat anecdotal, but I certainly think that there's a basis for it.
Just to add to that, I think it's interesting that one of the long-term declines which we are seeing when we think of class politics is the decline of the Indian left. The CPM, the CPI, and the decline of labor unions has been a long-term trend over the past. And if you see one sign of it is in this election, the CPM was trying to create a third front, and slowly all the regional parties have abandoned it. They really don't see any advantage in aligning with the left. And I think it's an interesting phenomenon where you might see a resurgence of class politics, but perhaps of a different type. That was the case with India earlier.
Yes, the gentleman here, Danielle. And then the lady back there. Let's take both of them just because we're running out of time, so we'll take both your questions and then they can respond.
So I just had a question which was kind of provoked by something that Rajiv said and relates to what just Devesh said. Should we be thinking about the scheduled tribe phenomenon slightly differently from all other groups is my question, because in some ways they are so marginalized both from markets and the state that, and of course, it's the heart of the Maoist insurrection and so on. So how do you interpret, voter preferences, whatever, when this is, because of the resource curse, geographical isolation, et cetera, they're basically out of it in some ways, out of the economy, out of politics. And so how should we be, thinking about scheduled tribes in India?
Great. Nice, tight question. Great.
Yeah, I'm Seema Paul, independent consultant on environment. My question is about gender as identity and whether you have a filter in your data collection. Around that, there has been a lot of violence in India against women recently, which in some ways I think probably reflects greater attention to the issue. And I was pleasantly surprised during my recent visit to India to find a couple of women raise it as their number one issue for voting. And I'm just wondering whether that's not an identity that must matter more moving forward. And so I ask. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Either.
Let me take the first one, and then Milan can.
Yeah.
I think it would be fair to say the encounter of indigenous peoples with capitalism worldwide has been a disaster. It doesn't matter if it's Brazil. It doesn't matter if it's the US. Worldwide, this has been a very, very troubling encounter, and India simply exemplifies that sort of global phenomenon. there's no doubt that if there's one group that stands out, most groups have gained since 91, some much more than others. Most regions have gained, some more than others. But I think one group where the marginalization continues to be acute, if not even more so, has been of what are called India's tribals. That is why you have the Maoist movement, which is centered around the tribals. And I don't think so, because the very things that supposedly will drive India forward, industrialization. For industrialization, you need, steel factories, aluminum factories, all of that stuff. All of that needs mines, access to mines. This is where the mines are. And it's something at some point is a zero-sum game. So it's going to be a very hard and troubling challenge. And in my mind, it's one of the singular challenges that any government of any ideology will have to face.
Thanks, Devesh.
Rajiv, do you want to say anything? Or should Go ahead. And I would just add to that I think one thing that's striking is that, one might make the statement, it's somewhat provocative, that Congress is winning these voters somewhat by default. And it's pretty striking that there is not yet really a well-articulated political movement, as there has been with Dalits and the BSP and Mayavati and the copycat movements with tribals in the same way. And I think that's a huge opportunity that doesn't seem to be, anyone hasn't assumed that mantle. On the issue of gender, we did ask public law and order. That was one of the issues which we thought might be an issue, particularly for women, given that it's been so much in the news for reasons that we all know. It was not, if you were to do the breakdown, not by rural-urban, but by male-female, the economy still dominates. The one area where, in fact, we see inflation mattering more, I was making this point to Sadanand yesterday when we were talking, is with women. Because, of course, these are people who actually know where the household money is actually going and what the price of onions is and so on and so forth, and they're much more in touch. And so this idea of rising female turnout, which has really been such a significant and positive trend in the state elections, which happened in December in 4 out of the 5 states, female turnout was higher than male turnout. And remember, these were Hindi heartland, socially conservative, quote-unquote backward states where females were actually voting in larger numbers than men. And that interaction with the economy, I think, is going to be very powerful against the incumbent. But public safety did not seem to percolate up to the top of the list of priorities for women.
Right. Unfortunately, I'm going to bring this session to a close. Fortunately, there's another panel, and it would be hard. It'd be hard for them to be as good as this panel was, but we'll see. But I want to thank Devesh and Rajiv and Milind for this panel and all of the questions.